Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today in War Thunder it is time to look at another devlog for updates 1.93. We're having a look at the Centurion Action 10 today, which is an improvement on the pre-existing idea of the Centurion. A lot of people see it as a stopgap measure between something like the Centurion and the Chieftain, which is why Gaijin have called it the Chieftain here. Now for me, it was just kind of a prototype which designed or had a bunch of different ideas that were taken forward into other designs and then eventually added into, the Chieftain idea. You can see the main difference is, of course, the turret on it, being the fact that it doesn't have a mantlet. It is all just one big large piece, which is definitely characteristic of some of the later versions of the vehicle, such as the FE4202 and also the Chieftain that we have in game. Now, the Centurion Action 10 was a prototype, as I talked about, and it came in a few different models, trying different guns, basically between the L7 and also the 20-pounder. The one which is going to be premium is going to have the 20-pounder gun. I'm wondering if we're going to get a standard Tech Tree L7 variant, maybe not at the same time, but maybe later on. And also, it's going to be rank 5, meaning that it joins the Centurion Avery as a rank 5 premium for the British. Now, what is interesting about this machine, the Centurion Action 10, is if we compare it to something like the Avery, I think it fits a hell of a lot better for a standard premium. I talked about in the last video, when it came to devblogs, about the KA50, how I have real issues with it being a premium, just because of the precedent that it sets, especially when we look at stuff like the G-Links. But for the Centurion Action 10, if we have a think about it, this is a vehicle that was fully built, it was fully tested as a prototype. It also had a different version, which had, as I said, the 105mm, the L7. And because of that, it means that you can easily put in a Tech Tree equivalent of it, and also have a version as a premium, which is slightly different with its gun, which won't make too much difference when it actually comes to the game. So for me, this is a much better pick for a rank 5 premium than something like the Centurion Avery, which we have at 7.0 right now. Because the Avery, even though it's different, it's quirky, some people will find it memey or interesting, it's not very good when it comes to actually grinding, and it's not very good when it comes to general meta vehicles. And you want premiums to be useful, but you also don't want them to be overpowered compared to their Tech Tree counterparts. So for me, the Action 10 makes complete sense to be a premium vehicle. Now, let's talk about its main factors. So obviously, it's sat on a Centurion chassis. The Centurion chassis that it's sat on is the Mark 7s. We don't actually have the Mark 7s in game, but one thing that was interesting is that the Centurion Mark 13, which is the last Centurion model, was actually passed to the developers in a most recent past the developers round. So I'm wondering if we're going to get some more of the sense in. The Mark 7, I believe, was one which was heavily used by the Australians, and it definitely would fit well into this area here, between either the Mark 3 and the Mark 10, or even between the Mark 10 and the Chieftain Mark 3. It's definitely one of those ones which, would fit all right. So if we have a look at that, the fact that it's a very bog standard Centurion chassis. So if, we have a look at the Mark III, the main differences, or the main issues with it is the upper glacis and the low glacis. It's not very strong, even for 6.7. You can easily go through this with the most of the meta guns. You think of the T44, T44-100, the Tiger II. The majority of guns at this level can easily chew through this armor, but the turret itself has a little bit more of a give to it. It can actually block a bunch of different shells. Now, they did just reduce the turret mantlets on the Mark 10, I believe, which is kind of sad for it, but it's still, okay. It's still got that 152, where before I believe it had around 200. The Centurion Mark 10 is one of my favorite tanks in the game. It's got a great gun on it. The APDS can sometimes fail, but overall, I think its general factors that it has, completely fine. But the one thing that the Centurion Action 10 brings is more armor to its turret. It doesn't really do anything to the hull. The hull should be exactly the same as its contemporaries. So you can see here it's very similar to the hull that we find on the Mark 10. You've got this little area here. I'm not sure if it'll have this 50mm plate on top of it. It doesn't look like it will if we have a look at this right here. So it's probably going to be similar to the Mark III chassis, which you just see here with the 76.2 without the 50mm plate on top. But the actual turret itself, even in the areas of without the slope effect, as it talks about here, similar to those vehicles, the turret of the Action 10 features very thick and highly sloped surfaces, giving it very decent ballistic protection. In fact, without a slope effect, the toughest parts of the Action 10's turrets reach up to 240mm in thickness. So this is why you're buying the machine. You're basically buying it to have a similar turret to the FV4202. You can see here the FV4202 in the areas which aren't very sloped, such as here. It has 240mm of thickness, so therefore, you know, it's going to be incredibly similar to this machine. And the Centurion Action X that you see here actually eventually morphed into the FV4202. So you can definitely, you know, there's going to be a lot of similarities when it comes to the turret of the machine. And of course it has the 20-pounder. If you've played the FV4202, you're going to have a very similar experience in it compared to, you know, the Centurion Action 10. The only difference, though, between the FV4202 and the Centurion Action 10 is the chassis. Now, the 202 does not have great armor, neither does the Centurion chassis, but one of the key differences between the 202 and the Centurion is this. The backward speed on a 4202 is 4.6 kilometers an hour, and then if you have a look at a Centurion's, it's 12.1. And I know this may not seem like a lot, but when you're talking about a vehicle which is going to be much more of a pokey vehicle, meaning that at range, because you've got good muzzle velocity with this gun, you know, with its APDS and with its normal AP rounds, you know, 1400 and 1000 respectively, you're going to poke out a cover, you're going to shoot something with your stabilizer, and you're going to move back. Right? That's basically the way to play these vehicles, as kind of a little bit of a hold-down machine. Now with the 202, that's hard to do because of the fact that you don't really have that backward speed. But with this thing, the Centurion Action 10, that is going to be possible to do. So I'm glad that, you know, we're going to finally get a bit of a pokey machine which has a good hold-down component to it, especially after, as I said, the Mark 10 got nerfed. Also, the Mark 10 and the Vickers are going up to 7.3, at least in the planned BR changes for October. We'll be covering that later on. And since this is a rank 5 vehicle, now we're into an interesting place. So, the monster lineup for Britain at these BRs is 6.7. The 4202, the Cent Mark III, the Carnarvon, and then you've got choices of the Tortoise, the FE, obviously the Barn, and then the STRV, which is a great replacement for any of those three vehicles that we talked about. So the question is, does the Centurion come in at 6.7 or does it come in at 7.0? Now for me, because it's very similar to the turret of the FV, but has the maneuverability of a Cent Mark III or a Cent Mark 10, I would say it's probably going to come in at 7.0, especially since it's rank 5. And this puts it in an awkward place, because the Mark 10 and the Vickers are getting moved up. So the only thing to 7.3. So the only thing you're going to have at your BR is the Conway. Now, the Conway is not a good vehicle. Doesn't have enough armor. The reload on the gun is really too long, and it also gets rid of one of the classic things which makes a lot of these British tanks really good: the 10 degrees of gun depression in favor of 5. You know, even the Barn has more gun depression than the Conway, which is kind of insane when you think about it. But for me, if it comes in at 7.0, it's going to see a lot less play than it would if it came in at 6.7. Now, yes, you could up-tier it into 7.3 along with the Conch being a really wonderful vehicle to use, especially when you get the Super Conch addition to it. But it's not going to be as, it's not going to be as potent as it would be at 6.7. I think if this thing comes in at 6.7 and a rank 5 with the same rewards that you find on the Avery, it will be a great pickup to have, just because it has, as I said, it has the mobility of these vehicles and also the best armor of these vehicles in the form of the 4202. If it doesn't, and it comes in higher, it's going to be a tougher sell. The last thing as well, so this is armed with a 20-pounder. The 20-pounder, or the 84mm, depending on how you want to see it, is a gun which has an interesting reputation when it comes to the game, for good reason. The gun is unreliable when it comes to the amount of damage it does, and that's really down to its APDS. Now, we know that the APDS is getting reworked. They said in a developer Q&A earlier this year that APDS will be getting, either a change in values, whether it be an increase in penetration, which then would give it an increase in damage, so on and so forth. But right now, what happens is a lot of the time, especially if you're fighting somebody with a good crew, you can penetrate them in exactly where you're supposed to. And what happens is you turn their crew into a bunch of Simpsons, meaning that you only turn them yellow, and then they look at you and your whole tank blows up. So, at least for me, I've been switching back to the APC-BC more, just because of the amount of damage that it does. You can see it's a 9.1 kilo round, compared to the APDS, which is 3.2. So the 3.2 kilograms a lot of the time just does not do the damage that's required. So even though this gun, it's very fast firing, all of these British guns have a few things in common. So the fact is, the L7s and the 20-pounders, they have a really good fire rate, amazing fire rate. They're also all stabilized. All these 6.7 machines that you see here, all stabilized, at least when it comes to the turreted machines, right? So that's great, that's really fun. Really good, stable gun platform, meaning that you can move in, move out, and, be able to shoot on the move. The reload being good, the gun depression being good, the turret rotation being good, 15.2 degrees is nothing to sniff at. They all have smokes as well, just to keep you alive. Like, there's a lot of good things when it comes to it, but the problem is the damage output of the gun is lacking. And what I'm worried about with this Centurion Action X, if it's brought in and the gun damage is not very good, or it's, it has the same issues as it did before with the 20-pounder, then it's going to be lackluster, and it doesn't have any extra things. Like, at least with the Avery, right? It's got that shotgun approach and the ERA, so it can do okay against heat. The STRV, if your gun is struggling, you can bring in the SS11 and maybe do something with that, even though it's quite hard to use. At least you have options. You don't have options in the Centurion Action X. You've got to make sure that gun works, and it works well. Otherwise, it's going to be a tough one. The overall ideas, though, I'm happy to see in the Centurion Action X. This devblog for me is a lot better than the first devblog, and I'm just happy to see this vehicle. And I'm happy to also hopefully, I should say, we see the other version of it in the tech tree to make sure that people aren't missing out when it comes to this type of vehicle. I'm sure we will with time. We'll see the other Action X with the L7, but at least right now you've got the FV4202, which is very similar to it, just in a different chassis form. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, John Ryman, Joseph Anders, Martinez, Mopar 1969, Moxie, Super Cacti, Uyans Terry, and Elove Goats, and of course Seductive Trash Can for supporting the channel.